Yeah, and we were just talking about Charlotte, and when the book came out in 1999, we did a program about Charlotte that was on Book TV. And at that time, 1999, it was 22 years ago. I mean, there still are people around, of course, who knew her, but 22 years pass and time goes on. So this is why I'm glad, I was happy to talk today, just to kind of reacquaint a lot of people with Charlotte Curtis and her mother, and that's another story, which we'll get to in a minute. But just 2 points before I go on. There's the cover of the book. It's not a PowerPoint, it's kind of low tech, but I have a couple other slides too, about some pivotal people in Charlotte's life and Charlotte. I got interested in Charlotte Curtis when I was finishing a dissertation at Ohio State, and I needed a dissertation topic. And when you pick a dissertation topic, and you may know this, it has to be something that you're really interested in, because you're living with it for 3 or 4 years. And so if it's something that you have no interest in, or that you don't like, it's very rough, very, very tough thing to do. So I had known Charlotte's name. I worked on the Citizen Journal, which no longer exists in Columbus, the Daily, and Charlotte worked on the Citizen. Now, I was on the Citizen Journal, in the 80s, and she was there in the 60s, but she became an editor at the New York Times. So people at the Citizen Journal would say to me, "Oh, somebody who used to work here is now famous. They became an editor at the New York Times." So there was this, kind of legendary quality about Charlotte Curtis. So I knew that she was from Columbus. I knew that she had worked on the New York Times, but that was all that I knew about her. And she died in 1987, and there were national stories written about her. There were not, everywhere. She got, of course, a New York Times obituary, Newsweek, et cetera, wrote obituaries about her. And I thought, and I was reading these obits, and I thought, boy, she's really very interesting. There's a lot more about her that I didn't know in the way of being pioneering. So I was thinking of, could that be a dissertation topic? And I talked to my dissertation chair, and he said, well, you're going to have original material, like letters and things. Otherwise, it's just going to be like a long magazine profile. You talk to people who knew her, you write about her background. That's not a dissertation. So I looked into it, and her husband, who lived in Columbus, William Hunt, was a doctor at Ohio State, and he survived her. And I said, does she by any chance have any papers or anything? And he said, I have boxes and boxes and boxes of her personal papers in our condo. This was about 3 years after she died, 2 or 3 years. It was like, I think 1989 or 90. And it was the mother lode. I mean, if you're doing research like this, to find original primary materials like that, especially when they're from the New York Times, you get editors' memos from the New York Times. So there was that, and then he really wanted somebody. He goes, I'm so happy to hear from you. I didn't know what kind of reception I was going to get. I mean, his wife died a couple years early. He had actually just had a heart attack, so he wasn't in great health. Oh, someone should do something on Charlotte. I've been wanting that. She was so wonderful and such a pioneer. So we had somebody who was willing to talk, and we had the papers. So one thing led to another. And I ended up doing it as a dissertation and then turning it into a book. And in a nutshell, this is who Charlotte was. And some of you may already know this, and this is why Bexley should be really proud of her. It's not just that she was somebody who worked in the New York Times from Bexley, which would have been a great accomplishment on its own. Charlotte was one of the people, and maybe the first person to change the tone of women's pages in newspapers in the United States. Up until the 60s, and when she started doing this in early, 60s, they were just real staid. There were recipes, there were wedding announcements that were real formulaic. They all kind of sounded the same. There was nothing unusual, you knew what you were getting in the women's pages, and it was like something out of the 40s and 50s. And every picture of a woman, they were very, well dressed, well coiffed, the whole thing. And she was the first one to really say, her big saying was, all brides are not beautiful. Because you have the beautiful blushing bride, the beautiful blushing bride. Well, all brides are not beautiful. She added like a humanity to the pages, and she added kind of a touch of humor. Like she felt she came from a well-to-do family, which I'll get to in a minute. And she knew that a lot of people who were from privileged upbringings, they weren't great 100% of the time. They didn't lead the Ozzie and Harriet life 100% of the time. She knew that, and that was reflected in the pages. And once the New York Times starts doing that in its pages, everybody else starts mimicking them. That's the style. So she, in the history of journalism, she's really a pivotal figure and always will be. And another reason I think, from Bexley should be proud is because she always came back to Bexley. She wasn't one of these people, well, I'm from Bexley, once every 5 years, she'd, come back to do a speech. She married somebody who lived in Columbus. Her mother lived in Bexley. So she was coming back to Columbus almost every other weekend to see, well, with her husband, and also to see her mother. She was very close to her mother. So there's a lot of levels on why she's just a really pivotal person in Bexley and in Columbus. So let me see. Here she is. This is when she was kind of and I'll get to this in a minute, but she was kind of at the height of her game as a women's editor at the New York Times. This is, you can see, this is a classic shot of her. The pearls, she almost always wore pearls. I always forget to say this, and this is kind of interesting. She was 5 feet tall and weighed like 100 pounds or less. She was this tiny thing. She had red hair. One of the stories about her that I read when I started the research, they called her the tiny person with the big byline was what they said. I think it was Newsweek, the tiny person with the big byline. So she was just kind of a dynamo, and she was just this tiny little thing. But anyway, I'll talk about her parents a little bit, just because to understand her, you almost have to understand her upbringing. I was just talking about her mother was, somebody should do a book on her mother. I mean, her mother was an amazing person. Her mother was the first woman in the Foreign Service. Her mother was pivotal in the Ohio suffrage movement. We'd be here 3 hours to talk about her mother. So I'm not going to say a lot about her mother, and if we have time at the end, I'll say a little more. But Charlotte, in a nutshell, her parents, well, her grandparents, I have to get this straight. She was born in 1928, and her mother was Lucille Atcherson. Her mother was born in Columbus, Sunbury Road. Her mother's mother, Fred Atcherson, and her grandmother, Charlotte, owned a lot of real estate in Columbus, was pretty well to do. I think he was a county commissioner. So Charlotte's grandparents, maternal grandparents, were pretty prominent and had a little money. Lucille, her mother, was their only child, the apple of their eye. Lucille wanted for nothing. She grew up out in the country, in Columbus, and went to the Columbus School for Girls, went to Smith College. She was born, I don't remember the exact date, it was like in the 1890s. Traveled overseas, when she was a teenager, was pretty sophisticated. So there were these roots to Ohio that the Atcherson family had, that Lucille had. One quick thing, her father was a Republican, and the only reason that's kind of, I'm saying that is because Charlotte was not a Republican. She was pretty progressive and left wing. But anyway, so there were a lot of ironies to this story, and that's one of them. So Lucille graduates from Columbus School for Girls. She was either 14 or 15. She was brilliant. She knew several languages, et cetera, et cetera. She becomes active in the Ohio suffrage movement. she just was introduced to it. And if you look at any history of the suffrage movement in Ohio, she's prominent in there, Lucille Atchison. And what this did, now you have to remember at the time, yes, it was fine for women to go to college, especially women from well-to-do backgrounds. But what was really desired was you went to college, but you got married and you had children. That's basically what you did. But she got active in the suffrage movement, and that just opened her eyes to a lot. It opened her eyes to, you know, social movements. She made friends, the whole business. So she decided that she wanted to, you know, do more with her life than get married. And this ended up, she wanted to join the Foreign Service. One thing led to another. There were no women overseas in the Foreign Service, so there were no Foreign Service officers at the time. She takes the Foreign Service exam. She scores the third highest grade of anybody who ever took it. Now you have to know history, geography, foreign languages. She gets the third highest grade. She gets appointed to the Foreign Service by Warren Harding because she met an assistant to Harding doing her suffrage stuff. So she gets appointed to the Foreign Service. The Senate okays it. There are no women, remember, overseas in the Foreign Service. The bad news is the Senate says, we're not sending a single woman overseas. That is not going to happen. And I think they sent her to Washington to do some stuff, which that wasn't what she wanted to do. She did not want to, you know, I shouldn't say push paper. It would be an important job, but that's not what she wanted. And I honestly don't remember what happened, but somehow she does persuade them to go overseas, and they send her to Bern, Switzerland. And there are a million letters. You know, she wrote letters home, which I've read. She really enjoyed being in Bern, Switzerland. She enjoyed seeing the world. But, you know, this didn't end well for her in the Foreign Service, which if we have time, I'll get to at the end. She wasn't getting the pay raises that the men were, go figure. So she disputes that. So she said, well, you know, why am I not getting these raises? Well, that was a mistake. Because the first thing they did when she said that is they sent her to Panama. She liked it, and so this was a punishment. And so that didn't work out. So she said she doesn't want to be in the Foreign Service anymore. Fortunately, though, when she was in Bern, she met Dr. George Morris Curtis, who was a research a surgeon. And he, at the time, was doing research on salt and iodine, because the iodine wasn't in salt at the time. She met him. I don't know, would she have married him if things worked out? I don't know, but they end up getting married. They end up getting married in, I believe it was early 1928. They move back. He gets a job at the University of Chicago. They move to Chicago. Lucille's really close to her parents, though, still goes to Columbus a lot to help them out. Charlotte was born in December of 1928. Her sister Mary was born either a year and a half or 2 years later. And so what Lucille did when they were toddlers, she just moved. I don't know if she moved back, but she spent a lot of time back in Columbus while her husband was at the University of Chicago. So the Curtis girls were really close to their grandparents, especially their grandmother, Charlotte, very close. And then after a couple years, he gets a job at Ohio State. So he's a research surgeon at Ohio State. This is great. You know, they're all in Columbus. Charlotte's upbringing, she went to this progressive school. As you know, first, second, third grade. I don't even think it's around anymore. But Dr. Hunt, who I interviewed at length about this, he laughed when he was telling me about it, because he said it was so progressive that if the kids had problems learning the multiplication tables, they just didn't have to learn them. You know, it's like, well, okay. And he gave me a great quote. It was something like, she could make a clock out of, I don't know, yarn, but she couldn't, you know, multiply 5 times 4. But anyway, that was when they were little. They both ended up going to the Columbus School for Girls. Charlotte, as you can imagine, Charlotte and her sister were taught the value of an education. They were taught the value of working, no idleness. And when they were at she talked about in interviews, the dinner table, as she put it, you couldn't just make wild assertions. Any opinion you gave, you had to back up. if you said something silly, you were called on it. And what their father did was he taught them anatomy, and he had them arrange on their plates the internal organs. And one of the great quotes in one of the stories interviews I read about her was, to this day, I could draw you a pituitary. So this was something that she remembered her whole life. Yes, they moved, I should add too, by this time, they had moved to Bexley. 311 North Drexel was the house. And I don't remember exactly when they moved, but she spent most of her childhood in that Drexel home. So things were going fine. Charlotte decides to go to Vassar, which was unusual because her mother went to Smith and her younger sister went to Smith. She goes to Vassar. I read all these letters home that she wrote home. She really wasn't on any writing thing in Vassar, but she wrote a ton of letters home. And she was called Rusty. She had, the red hair. Actually, let me just move this. Actually, I'm sorry. This is her mother. Should have showed you that before. That's a great photo of Lucille. And here's Charlotte. What's interesting too, and this is just kind of an interesting fact, Charlotte was always little, even, only 5 feet, fully grown, red hair. Her mother was kind of tall and husky, and her sister was blonde and tall and husky. So it was just a weird thing. She was this tiny little redhead, and her her sister and her mother were kind of these tall, kind of husky blonde. So maybe that's why she went to Vassar and not Smith like they did. But she was a little bit different. Her sister was a tomboy. Her sister told me this, that her sister was a tomboy, would go fishing with the father. The father really liked to go fly fishing, and that just had no interest for Charlotte. She didn't do athletics. She didn't particularly like to go fishing. But so there were differences there, just as far as the way they were. But anyway, so Charlotte, I'm going to come back to this. Well, we'll get to this in a minute. Charlotte goes to Vassar. She goes with her friends to New York a lot because she wrote to her parents about what they did in New York, and the plays she saw. She would give little thumbnail reviews of the plays. So she really liked the nightlife in New York. What's kind of interesting though, when she was at Vassar, she didn't date anybody, from New York or that area. She was dating someone from Columbus. She was dating somebody from Circleville, a guy named Dwight Fullerton, who was I don't remember where he went to school, but he was a law student. So when she came back, over the summer, she would see him. But nonetheless, she had a pretty active social life at Vassar. At Vassar, she met a lot of important people. Jackie Kennedy, was Jackie Bouvier at the time, lived in the dorm that she lived in. Jackie was, I think, a year and a half younger, and she knew Jackie. They were not friends, but she knew her from living in the same dorm. Her roommate was somebody named, well, I don't remember her maiden name, but her roommate became somebody named Selma Roosevelt. They called her Lucky Roosevelt. She ended up becoming a Roosevelt and marrying one of the sons of the Roosevelts. And also Lucky Roosevelt was an assistant to Ronald Reagan. She was in the Reagan administration as not in a cabinet position, but some kind of assistant to him. So just the people she met who would become well-known, after they graduated. Okay, so she comes home from college over the summer, and this is where things really start to heat up. She takes a job on the Columbus Citizen for the summer, which is unusual because she liked to write, but she wasn't on a yearbook or anything like that at Vassar. But she takes a job in the women's section of the Citizen. Then she goes back to Vassar. The next summer, she works at the Citizen. And she said this is where she really became addicted to newspaper work. And she notes in interviews that that was really odd because at the time, now it was a women's section, so it was a little more genteel, but she said newspaper reporters at the time, she called them, they were like railroad workers, you know, they were blue collar, not many had college degrees, you know. So she liked that. She said, they called me Vassar. That was her name, you know, when she worked at a Citizen, they called her Vassar. So she just started to get a real taste for the life of newspapers. Very few women were news reporters then. There were some, but I mean, nationally, very few. So it was natural that she worked in the women's section. So what happens? She graduates from Vassar. She has a degree in, she took a lot of sociology and anthropology. She has a degree in like I don't know, modern culture. So it was some weird major that I think she kind of combined some things. So she comes back, gets married to this person, Dwight Fullerton, and gets a job full-time at the Citizen and the women's section. And the good news is she loved the job and she was a full-time person, you know, full-time employee. The bad news is her husband hated the people at the newspaper. And so she was spending more time with friends at the paper. He was not liking it. The marriage did not last. I don't know, it was a couple years. I don't know how many years, not that many. So she gets divorced. That was not a good match. But what happens when she starts working in Columbus, she starts doing what kind of propelled her to fame in journalism at the New York Times. She starts straying from the formulaic writing on the women's pages. She starts kind of subtly mocking some of the people she's writing about. Doesn't do it all the time, but does it a little bit. There are a lot of examples of this. One of them, and some of them you'd almost have to read the story, but one of them was there was a big flower show in Columbus. I guess it was huge. And she was writing about the flower show. It was coming up. And she starts writing about these women in the flower show, how she kind of implies these people are way too serious about this flower show. She's quoting them. There was a bad winter or something. And so the tulips weren't coming out right. And people were really upset because they didn't think the tulips were going to be right. And so she writes something, she has a quote, I'm worried about the tulips, she said, visibly moved. And then she was quoting someone else that I'm worried that this is going to happen. And her lip was trembling as she said it. So, and then she quotes somebody saying, yes, 20 years ago, you know, I had 18 flowers and 25 years ago, I had 20, you know, her whole point was this is like being thought of way too seriously. So it was a subtle mocking. She did that in other ways too. Like, you know, these people, you know, they are taking this a little too seriously. Now, what happened? So this was accepted at the Citizen, but every once in a while, somebody would complain to the editor. And the editor every once in a while would say to Charlotte, you know, you don't mock our readers. Don't do that anymore. And Charlotte had the reaction that she had when she was at the New York Times when they told her the same thing. She just kept doing it. You know, it was like, it was not affected at all. And there's another example here. There was somebody who came from a hairdresser, a French hairdresser, visited Columbus. So when she's quoting the hairdresser, she kind of quotes his accent. So she's like, he was saying, so the example, I don't like the high lifted bangs. And she was, I don't like Z-E-E, high lifted, L-E-E-F-T-E-D. So she's mocking this guy's accent, you know, in the story. So what happened, you know, essentially was this was the style that she ended up doing the same thing at the New York Times. And it was a much bigger stage, and you can imagine a much, you know, bigger audience. And they accepted it there. That's a whole other story, which I'll get to, you know. So anyway, in 1960-61, she'd been at the Citizen for 10 years. At that point, the Citizen merged with the Ohio State Journal. there were 3 papers in Columbus at the time, the Ohio State Journal, the Citizen, and the Dispatch. Then there were 2. The Citizen merges with the Ohio State Journal. And I think she thinks it's time to go. Weird things. She did have an affair with somebody on the paper, one of the news reporters who happened to be married. So that didn't work out, but that lasted a couple of years. So she wants to move to New York. She applies at newspapers in New York. She wanted to be a news reporter or a feature. She did not want to be on the women's section. She applies at particularly the Herald Tribune, which no longer exists. If you know anything about the history of newspapers in New York, that was considered the writer's paper. You know, if you really valued writing, that was where you went. She didn't get that job, but she did get a job at on the women's section at the New York Times. The women's editor read some of her, stories and said, I like the story, but are you sure you want to be on the women's section? And she said, yes. Now, once again, this was early 1960s. The women's section at the Times was called Food, Fashion, Family, and Furnishings, known as the 4 Fs. That was very well known in journalism, the 4 Fs of the New York Times. And once again, we had a real staid kind of page. It was all about women's hats. It was recipes. Any stories about families were about, perfect families. So in comes Charlotte. All right. And so she's in this environment. The women's editor at the time actually was British and came from a magazine background. So she actually liked longer stories. So she gave the reporters of the women's section leeway to do longer stories, which was unusual kind of with some of these women's stories. So Charlotte starts doing longer stories. And what does she do? She starts doing what she did in Columbus, where she starts subtly mocking some of the people that she was writing about. She really kind of hit her stride. She did some stories on the wealthy because, there was a New York Times. There were a lot of stories done on wealthy people, and wealthy people were always treated very well. I mean, they didn't look silly. They were wealthy. They had lots of things and good for them. But she started doing stories on some wealthy people. And for instance, and this was pretty much what she did. There was one family in San Francisco, and there was some kind of money issue in San Francisco. I don't know what was going on, but this family had to cut back. So she quotes this woman as saying, "I'm down to 4 servants now. I only have a personal maid, a cook, and a clean." Anyway, so she writes, "I'm down to four servants now." That would have never been in the paper before, anything like that. So she doesn't do this all the time, but she does it occasionally. And this is where she really struck gold. The assistant managing editor of the New York Times at the time was a guy named Clifton Daniel. Clifton Daniel was from a small town in North Carolina. Father was a pharmacist, but for a couple years, he was a foreign correspondent at the New York Times, where he met Margaret Truman, and they got married. So he's married to Margaret Truman. So he meets all kinds of interesting people, the circles that he hangs around with. And he's reading some of Charlotte's stories, and he goes, "You are so right. I meet these rich people and they act so weird and they're crazy and they're entitled, but you'd never know that reading our paper, because the things that I hear, and the things that they do, and you're really hitting it on the head here." So he loved what she did when she would mock, particularly the wealthy. So once she got an in with one of the top editors of the New York Times, she was gold. So he's assistant managing editor. He becomes managing editor. And at this point, the women's editor retires. So Charlotte is named women's editor / society editor. This is when women's pages nationally, not just the New York Times, start doing more society. They merge in doing more society stories. The first thing, one of the first things that happens with the women's pages is there's more serious stories. There's stories about single mothers. In the women's pages, we would have never seen that. There's abortion related stories. You would have never seen that. So she's changing the tenor of the women's pages. And so what happens then? Other papers follow. So the Times, the Times does something, everybody else does it, as being one of the leading, if not the leading paper in the country and the world. Now, about this time, and I don't know exactly when, maybe late 60s. Yeah, and this is actually Charlotte interviewing. The caption on this was, he's the Duke, I don't know, the Duke of Marlborough or something, but he's a rich guy. And this was I like this photo because this was a traditional Charlotte photo. She's always got the notebook. She's never without the notebook. So this was from my book. This is kind of a classic photo. Whoops, going backwards here. So she's, I guess it was the late 60s. I don't know exactly. Charlotte was going home a lot to Bexley because her mother was in Bexley. She was very close to her mother. She always sought her mother's approval. It was the whole mother-daughter thing. And so even though she had an apartment in Greenwich Village, she went on weekends, not every weekend, but she went home a lot to see her mother, who suffered from depression. Lucille, you'd never know it just because she was always moving. Like even when she was in her 80s, she was going overseas, but she did suffer from depression. And I think Charlotte was worried about that. By that time, her sister had moved to California. So her sister wasn't very close, she just geographically. So she meets William Hunt, who at the time was head of neurosurgery at Ohio State. He's also a native from Columbus. Now, William Hunt was a student of George Curtis. So he got his medical degree at Ohio State. And Charlotte and Dr. Hunt, who I talked to at length, of course, for the book, would tell this, Charlotte would tell the story, and he told me this, that I guess when Mary and Charlotte were 12 or 13 years old, George Curtis had his students, his medical students at home, like, I don't know, for lunch or whatever, or for dinner, or he'd have them, a group of them at his home. And Charlotte and Mary would sit by on the stairs and watch them, giggling. And she likes to say that when she was 12 or 13, Bill Hunt must have been one of those medical students. And when she was sitting on the stage or on the stairs, watching the students, he was 7 years older than she was. He was, they met at various, they're from Columbus. They traveled in the same circles. They met, they didn't just meet and start going out, but they had met. And then at some point they started going out. He was married, but separated when they started going out. He had 3 grown kids. I think the youngest one may have been maybe 17 or 18. And there were 2 others who were older than that. But anyway, then at some point, I think in the early 70s, he lived at Summit Chase in Grandview. And that was the apartment that she went to when she came back to Columbus. And I was there because that's where I interviewed him. And it's a penthouse. It was a gorgeous, gorgeous condo, I guess. Anyway, but things are going well for her because, the job, she's got a boss who lets her do, what she wants to do. She seems to be having a good relationship, or at least a happy relationship with William Hunt. Let me see if I can. Yeah, there's and I will tell you, when I interviewed him, that's how he looked. I mean, he was, I thought he was really handsome. He was really a nice guy. Very just, I talked to him 2 or 3 years after Charlotte died. He was still pretty distraught. I mean, he was, still, of course, really missed her. But what happened with Charlotte, as time went on at the New York Times, she became close, professionally, to Clifton Daniel, which not only let her write the story she wanted to do. Clifton Daniel was a honcho at the Times. He was a top editor. He was married to Margaret Truman. So he was in like real kind of upper class circles, including the publisher of the Times. The Times was and is a family-owned newspaper. The Sulzbergers, they've owned the paper for many decades. And the Sulzbergers and their relatives have owned it since the late 1800s. But anyway, what I'm getting at here is she started becoming a friend of the publisher. A.O. Punch Sulzberger. If you've read any history of the time, you hear about Punch. That was his nickname. He was the publisher of the New York Times. You can imagine that's an enormous job. It's one of the, at the time, it was one of the most powerful jobs in journalism in the world, probably. So she starts going to all these parties that the publisher has. The publisher and his family had a huge country home in Connecticut, and you weren't invited there unless you were somebody, so she was invited there. So she becomes part of this really rarefied inner circle at the Times and ends up, doing what she wants to do. One quick example, if the publisher likes you, which he did, you can do anything you want. Punch Sulzberger would golf with people, and every once in a while, someone would complain, you really made my aunt, Charlotte Curtis really made my aunt look silly in a story that she did. Why did she do that? And Punch wouldn't really care. And one time he told her, she wrote a story about somebody with a lot of money and said, she had diamond earrings and diamond necklace and a sapphire bracelet. She was dripping in diamonds. And somebody said to Punch, what are you doing? Why is she saying that she's dripping in diamonds? That's ridiculous. And so he passes that on to Charlotte, and Charlotte goes, he's right. She was also dripping in sapphires. So that's what she got away with once you're friends with the publisher. Just real quickly, and I've got to hurry here because we're like, she's doing okay. Charlotte's doing okay as editor of the the society section until Clifton Daniel gets promoted / demoted. He was managing editor. He technically gets promoted, but it's a demotion because he's not doing the day-to-day anymore. So her boss becomes a guy named A.M. Abe Rosenthal. He's a legendary editor at the New York Times. He becomes managing editor of the Times. Clifton Daniel's on the Times, but he's out of it. He did not like Charlotte. He did not like anything about her. He didn't like her politics. He was kind of to the right. He didn't like her stories. He starts kind of telling her, you can't do this anymore. So fortunately at this time, it was in the early 70s, there was an opening on the op-ed section of the New York Times. If you've ever seen the Times, it's the page opposite of the editorial page where the columnists are. This is a very prestigious page. It was then and it is now. Harrison Salisbury, legendary Russian reporter for the Times, was the editor. Extremely prestigious job. He had to take mandatory retirement because there was a mandatory retirement. He handpicks his successor. It's Charlotte. He likes Charlotte. He thinks she's creative. So she goes into a whole new direction where she becomes op-ed editor, one of the most prestigious jobs in the world as far as journalism. She gets her name on the masthead. That's the list of editors that you see in the editorial page. First woman top editor with her name on the masthead in Times history. Her title was associate editor. And she changed she changed op-ed pages too. They were almost always politicians, academics. She had Yoko Ono do something, and which at the time was pretty revolutionary. She had what was considered unusual people write op-eds. And Harrison Salisbury loved that. That's exactly what he wanted. I interviewed him about her, and he said she was one of the most creative, brilliant people that I've ever met. And this is from somebody who's pretty brilliant. So this is, so she leaves the women's section, but she actually, you know, is really in many ways promoted. She has a pretty good, you know, run in the op-ed, probably for 7 or 8 years. And as happens in a lot of places of employment, the dominoes start falling. You got to remember, Rosenthal still didn't like her. I mean, even though he kind of got away from her because she wasn't on news or women's section anymore, he really did not like her. So things are going all right. Then they decide to name a new regime at the editorial pages of the Times. So that was it for her. New editorial page editor, new op-ed editor. So, and just one quick thing before I go on, and we're kind of coming to the end of her now. She had friends at the paper, but she kind of alienated many of the women at the paper. In 1977, there was this landmark discrimination, gender discrimination case at the New York Times. It was 500 women filed suit against the Times for pay inequity. It was a huge story. It was a huge big deal. Charlotte didn't take part in the lawsuit. She didn't sign anything. She didn't march. She didn't do anything because she said, you know, I'm management. I can't protest against management because I am management. She was op-ed editor. And the women were furious at her. And I talked to Dr. Hunt about this, and he said, you know, she was upset about that, but she felt she couldn't do it. And she donated a lot of money to their cause, but she never put her name on the suit. You know, there were 1 or 2 women that I worked with her that I interviewed, that I wanted to interview, one in particular. And I said, can I, you know, talk to you? You work with Charlotte. And she sends me, there was no internet then. She sends me a postcard. She says, I could stand Charlotte. I'm not going to talk to you about Charlotte. You don't want me to talk. You don't want me to say anything about Charlotte. They were really upset. But it happens. And according to Dr. Hunt, the whole thing kind of upset her. But anyway, so when she leaves the op-ed page, what happens with a lot of people like that, they'll give them an op-ed column. You know, you'll see them once a week, and it's probably still that way. Well, Rosenthal said, you're not getting an op-ed column. So what happened was they did give her a column once a week, but it was on the inside of the news pages, which in the hierarchy of the Times, you know, that's not as prestigious. She was able to write a column, but it wasn't on the op-ed. And she was pretty crushed about that. And there was nothing the publisher could do. I think she didn't complain to the publisher, but she said something to him, and he said, well, he's the editor and that's what he wants. And by this point, this was in the early 80s, the column was just so-so. It didn't seem to have the spark that she had. And it turned out she wasn't feeling well. Now, Charlotte had breast cancer, and I'm not even sure when, but she had recovered from it. I think it was in the late 60s. And she wasn't feeling well, and they thought, ironically, she was diagnosed being hyperthyroid. And I say ironically because it was her father that put the iodine in you know, in salt, but she was hyperthyroid, and Dr. Hunt told me, you know, we were so relieved when she got that diagnosis because that's treatable, you know. Well, it ended up that the cancer had come back, and a year or two, you know, she ended up, I think, she worked a while with it, and she didn't tell anybody. She was pretty secretive about, I'm not secretive, but she just didn't tell people a lot about her personal life. She didn't tell anybody until she finally got so sick, she came back to Columbus. And I think it was about a year or so. And Dr. Hunt was telling me, you know, she knew it was terminal. And a couple months before she died, she made a list of who she wanted to talk at her memorial service. There were listed like 7 or 8 people, and she wanted to be in front of the fountain at the Lincoln Center because she loved that locale, and that's exactly where her memorial service was. And Dr. Hunt said to me, you know, and this almost, it sounds almost like a movie. He said she died in May, and a couple of days before she died, the window was open, the breeze was coming in, and she said, I'm just happy because I've got the breeze of Ohio coming in the window. And I do believe that she said that, because she really was loyal to the state. She was loyal to Ohio. She used to kid around and you know, she'd tell people, I'm just a little girl from Ohio, or people would say, you know, she was pretty sophisticated. And whenever anyone would say that, she'd always go, I'm just a little girl from Ohio. That was kind of one of the things she always said. I'm going to open up the questions. There's one quick thing here. Yeah, I love this picture. This is her mother. This is Lucille when she was in the Foreign Service. And that is such a great picture. What happened was she quit the Foreign Service just because of what happened. They gave her a bad performance evaluation, which probably wasn't fair. So she left. But in 1978, the Foreign Service honored her, and they honored her as the first woman, and they honored the first Black person. So it ended up that I guess she's, you know, now one of the people, one of the famous people, one of the first in the Foreign Service, even though it was a little late. But by the way, her mother lived to be 91. Lucille lived to be 91 and died like a year before Charlotte did. And Charlotte, of course, was 58, which is much too young. But anyway, so that is, I think, that is one of my favorite pictures. It's a great picture of Lucille Curtis. That was a lot smashed in. There's a lot. I guess I'm not good at promoting my books, but I will say if you want to know more, the books are still available online and, you know, on Amazon. But yeah, I'm happy to take any questions that anybody has.
Any questions?
I just want to say a comment that we got online was, what a great talk about a fascinating person. I could hear a lot more.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for bringing that up. One quick thing, I guess, and I have a couple notes here that I didn't get to. A couple of Charlotte's famous stories. There were two in particular that still live on, and you might have heard of these because I read about them every 5 or 10 years. Leonard Bernstein, the composer, had a famous meeting with the Black Panthers, and this is a pretty well-known meeting where a lot of the kind of rich people in New York were sympathetic to the Black Panthers at their time. So he had them over at their penthouse because they felt that people look at them as criminals and they're not. They have, a legitimate story. And by this point, there was a lot of violence initiated by the Black Panthers, but he had a handful of them over at his house, and Charlotte was there, and she wrote a pretty mocking story. She's quoting Bernstein in this beautiful penthouse, and he's Leonard Bernstein. And he's listening to the Black Panthers saying, we got to overthrow the government, being very radical. And we got to redistribute the wealth, or whatever they said. And I dig absolutely. And he's quoting, Bernstein using this kind of this slang where he looks pretty silly, frankly. There was that one. And then there was the famous black and white ball. Truman Capote had this huge black and white ball. Everybody had to wear black and white and in a costume. And it was to honor Katharine Graham, the publisher of the Washington Post. And everybody had to wear black or white. And it was the party of the year. And New York at the time, I think it was 61, it was like anyone who was anyone was invited. And if you weren't invited, if you weren't on the list, if Capote didn't put you on the list, you were nobody. And so a lot of the people who weren't there said, oh, I was invited, I was out of town. I would have been there, but I was out of town, which of course they weren't. Charlotte got the list leaked to her. So there's this list of like 150 people, and they print it in the paper. So that way, if you said, oh, I was invited, I just was out of town that week, you were busted. So that was a huge story. That was a national story about all these people who were not invited to this famous black and white ball that Truman Capote. I was just, every 5 or 10 years at the anniversary of this, there's a story about the famous black and white ball.
Did Lucille engage in any social causes when she was in Columbus?
Yeah, she was actually on a million of them. She was actually on a lot of boards. In fact, I was just like, I know the symphony board stands out, but there were many of them. She was extremely, extremely active in cultural and social boards and events in Columbus. And she's honored too. I mean, very, and I should know this, but various organizations in Columbus have honored her over the years. That's a good question. Also, she traveled a lot when she was like in her 80s. I mean, she at one time, Charlotte in the interview goes, my mother's at a yurt right now. So she was like 80 years old.
Question back here.
2 questions. Who inspired Charlotte to be a journalist?
You know, it was Anne OHare McCormick. Does anybody know who that is? Anne OHare McCormick. That's a good question because she did have a role model. When Charlotte was growing up, there was a woman named Anne OHare McCormick from Columbus. And I'm sorry? No, that might have been another one. But she was married, and I should have looked into this. She didn't work full time as a reporter. But she did some, I think for some reason, she interviewed Mussolini, I think. She was one of the first people to get an interview with Mussolini. But and she was from Columbus and she had red hair. So there is an answer to that. And that's the answer because in interviews, she always talked about Anne OHare McCormick.
Is her sister still alive?
I don't know. Her sister would have been born in 1930. So I don't know. Her sister, I interviewed her sister for hours. She's wonderful, wonderful person. Everybody was. Dr. Hunt gave me her typewriter. She had the manual typewriter, which I still have. And what happened was, and this is kind of interesting, he had all her papers, as I said, like 10 box loads. And he goes, I want to send these to Radcliffe. There's a, women's studies, and he should, so people could access them. And he goes, and they were just overflowing and they were all a mess. And he said, you can have access to them in our apartment if you mail them back, if you box them up and send them to Radcliffe. It was like, that's a deal. I mean, I was happy, to be able to do that and go through all those, because he said, I don't have the stomach to buy, and I don't blame him. I mean, it's a hard job. I mean, of course he could have hired somebody to do it, but he was just being very nice. So when I was done with them, I boxed them all up and sent them over to Radcliffe. Well, they probably, I'm assuming they still are. So, any other questions?
Thank you.
Thank you.
I believe the library is open for 4 more minutes if you need the elevator, or let me know. Otherwise, we have the exit here.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it. Good questions.